Chapter 1. Kneel. Zelia didn't, so they killed her family instead. No one spoke. Not even the gods dared to breathe. Look at her. King Vorig's voice boomed across the great hall, shattering the heavy silence. The last pathetic rat of a dead bloodline. Zelia remained on her knees in the center of the room. The cold floor bit into her bare skin. She didn't lower her gaze. You murdered them. Vorig laughed. I cleansed my kingdom. He turned his massive head toward the shadows near the pillars. Jax, step forward. Jax stepped into the candlelight. He was shaking. Zelia's chest tightened. My mate. Jax, she whispered. He wouldn't look at her. He stared firmly at the king's boots. Say it, boy, Vorag commanded. Jax, please, Zelia begged. Her voice cracked. They slaughtered my father. Don't do this. Jax squeezed his eyes shut. His jaw trembled. Then he opened his eyes, and they were completely cold. I, Alpha Jax of the Silver Moon, reject you, Zelia, he sneered, his voice laced with absolute disgust. I would rather mate a corpse than a traitor. The word struck her like a physical blow. The mate bond snapped inside her chest. Her body convulsed as something foundational broke loose. She gasped for air, but the oxygen felt like crushed glass. Good boy. Lord Thorn stepped out from behind the king's throne. He held a long iron rod in his hands. The tip glowed a violent, angry orange. A stray dog doesn't need a noble crest. Don't touch me, Zelia spat. Thorn grabbed the shoulder of her dress. The fabric ripped easily, exposing her bare skin. Hold her down. Two heavily armored guards forced her face against the stones. This is what happens to filth, Thorn whispered directly into her ear. He pressed the iron down. The sickening sizzle filled the dead silence of the hall. The acrid smell of burning flesh hit the air heavily. Agony ripped through her nerves, white-hot and blinding. Her body shook violently, her fingers curling until her nails dug deep into her own palms. She bit her lip. She tasted copper. But she clamped her jaw shut. She refused to give them a scream. When he finally pulled the iron away, the word slave was burned permanently into her flesh. Throw her to the Forbidden Island, Vorag ordered, waving his hand in disgust. Let the mud and the beasts take her. The island was a graveyard. Zelia clawed through the freezing mud. Every breath was a battle. Her shoulder burned with infection. Her body was failing. Give up. The deep voice came from the shadows of the twisted trees. Zelia collapsed against a rotting log. She coughed violently, clutching her chest. Who's there? An old man stepped into the pale moonlight. His eyes glowed with an ancient, terrifying gold. Former King Thalon, the ghost of the realm. You are dying, little wolf, Thalon said. His voice carried zero pity. Your pack is dead. Your mate threw you away. You carry the brand of a slave. I am no slave, she rasped. Your body says otherwise. My body is just meat. She forced herself onto her hands and knees. The mud sucked at her bleeding fingers. I don't care about my mate. I don't care about this pain. Thalon tilted his head. Then what do you care about? Vorig. Zelia looked up. Her eyes were hollow, but a feral, untamed spark remained. Thorn, I want them to burn. Will you burn the world to reach them? I will become the fire. Thalon walked toward her. He raised his hand. The golden light intensified, blinding her. Then take my mark. But hear me, little wolf. Most who ask for this power beg me to stop when it starts. If you are weak, it will turn you to ash. If you survive, give it to me, she demanded. He slammed his glowing palm directly over her fresh burn. 10 years later. The wooden dock groaned under the weight of the massive trading ship. The saltwater wind was bitter, biting through thick clothing. Zelia stepped onto the plank. "No, Mainland," the ship's captain announced. He kept his distance, his hands trembling slightly as he held the ropes. "You paid in gold. We brought you here. Now get off my ship." Zelia pulled her dark hood over her head. The heavy cloak hid the scars that covered her arms. It hid the lethal grace in her steps. "You shouldn't be here," the captain warned, his voice dropping to a harsh, nervous whisper. "King Vorag's guards patrol these docks. They kill strangers on sight." Zelia didn't look at him. She reached up and touched her left shoulder. Beneath the thick fabric of her cloak, the old slave brand remained. But right beneath the jagged scar tissue, the golden mark of the first alpha pulsed with a quiet, terrifying rhythm. As she stepped off the plank, 3 heavily armored guards blocked her path. They wore King Vorag's crest. "Halt!" the lead guard barked. He rested his hand on the hilt of his sword. "State your business, stray." "I am passing through," Zelia said. "Take off the hood." "No." The guard laughed. "You don't say no to Vorag's men." He reached out to grab her cloak. Zelia moved. She didn't draw a weapon. She simply grabbed his wrist. The sharp snap of bone was deafening. The guard dropped to his knees, screaming in agony. The other 2 drew their swords instantly. "Kill her!" "You can try." She swept the legs of the second guard, sending him crashing heavily into the wooden crates. The wood splintered. The third guard swung his blade. Zelia dodged, her movements a blur, and slammed the heel of her boot directly into his chest. The impact echoed loudly. He flew backward, hitting the stone wall. His body went completely still. The lead guard cradled his ruined arm, staring up at her in absolute terror. The hood had slipped back, revealing her scarred face and eyes that now burned with a blinding golden light. "Who? What are you?" he gasped. Zelia stepped forward. She placed her heavy boot directly over his chest, pinning him against the wooden dock. She pressed down, cutting off his air. "Tell Vorag, the girl he buried is coming back for his throat." Chapter 2. Vex's tavern smelled of spilled ale, cheap sweat, and secrets. Zelia kept her head down, weaving through the crowded, noisy room. She only needed a map of the inner city to reach Vorag's fortress. Then the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The air in the tavern suddenly grew heavy. The drunken laughter faded into a nervous murmur. A predator had entered the room, a massive one. Zelia didn't look back. She slipped through the side door and stepped into the pitch-black, narrow alleyway. Before her boots even hit the dirt, a shadow blocked her exit. General Kieran, the king's loyal executioner. He was a towering wall of muscle, radiating a lethal, overwhelming stillness. Moving fast for a ghost, his voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the damp air. Zelia reached for the hidden blade in her boot. She never made it. In a fraction of a second, he closed the distance. No weapons were drawn. It was pure, overpowering instinct. He slammed her back against the wet brick wall. The impact knocked the breath straight from her lungs. "Don't," he growled. His large, rough hand slid under her heavy cloak. He bypassed her weapons entirely and gripped her bare waist. His thick fingers dug into her skin, locking her firmly in place. The blistering heat radiating from his palm was suffocating. "Let me go," Zelia ordered. Her voice didn't shake. "I shouldn't touch you," Kieran hissed. His jaw tightened so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. Yet his grip only tightened, pressing her closer. "I should snap your neck for what you did to Vorag's men at the docks." "Then do it." "I can't." He grabbed a fistful of her hair. He didn't pull to hurt her. He pulled just enough to force her head back, fully exposing her sensitive throat to the darkness. For a terrifying second, he didn't move. Neither did she. The world seemed to hold its breath with them. Pressed flush against his massive frame, Zelia felt it, the violent, erratic pounding of his chest. This was the kingdom's most cold-blooded killer, yet he was visibly trembling. Her own pulse betrayed her, hammering frantically against her ribs. Without thinking, her fingers curled, digging fiercely into the thick fabric of his tunic as if grounding herself. Kieran leaned in, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He closed his eyes. He breathed in deeply, inhaling the scent of rain, cold steel, and ancient ash that clung to her skin. A feral, desperate groan vibrated deep in his chest. The tension in the narrow alley was thick enough to choke on. "General," Zelia whispered. Her own breath hitched, betraying the icy facade. He dragged his lips slowly up her jawline, stopping a single millimeter from her mouth. She could feel his jagged, uneven breaths on her own lips. "You belong in a grave," he murmured. His eyes snapped open, flashing with a dark, untamed obsession. Then he froze. His nose brushed against her left shoulder. He inhaled again. The scent hit him like a jagged blade to the throat. The dark lust in his eyes vanished instantly. Something inside him snapped. Not anger. Something far worse. "What is this?" he snarled, his voice dropping to a demonic register. Zelia stiffened. "It's none of your business." Kieran stepped back, his massive chest heaving. The shadows seemed to writhe violently around him. "The mark on you reeks of another," Kieran growled, his fists clenching until his knuckles turned white. "I will find him. I will tear him apart piece by piece." He turned his back to her, melting away into the pitch-black alley. And then his voice echoed back through the darkness, dripping with a lethal, obsessive promise. "When I am done with you, you won't remember how to belong to anyone else." He left her standing there, gasping for air, her fingers still curled as if holding onto a ghost. Chapter 3. Well, look what crawled out of the mud. Lord Thorne stood on the high balcony, looking down at the enclosed courtyard. He swirled a glass of dark wine, a lazy smirk on his face. Down below, Zelia stood completely surrounded. 20 of Vorig's elite guards formed a tight circle of steel around her. "You always were a broken toy," Thorne sneered, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I gave you a proper label 10 years ago. Why did you come back to get it dirty?" Zelia didn't look at the guards. She stared straight up at the balcony. "Come down here, Thorne. Let me show you what the mud taught me." Thorne stopped smiling. He waved his hand. "Put her down." The guards charged. Zelia became a blur of lethal precision. She didn't waste movement. She dodged a heavy axe, sweeping the attacker's legs. He hit the cobblestone and didn't get up. She ducked under a sword strike, driving her elbow into another guard's throat. She was winning. Then a sharp whistle cut through the air. Thwack! Zelia stumbled. She looked down. A black-shafted arrow was buried deep in her chest, just inches from her heart. "Black-silver poison," Thorne laughed from above. "Sleep well, Stray." Black veins instantly spiderwebbed across Zelia's pale skin. The poison paralyzed her lungs. Her vision blurred into darkness, and she hit the cold stone floor. A mile away, Kieran froze. The world around him muted. The roaring wind, the clash of training swords in the barracks, the shouts of his men, it all vanished. Only a high-pitched ringing remained in his ears, and her heartbeat. He could always hear it. But now the rhythm was wrong. It was erratic, fading. Thump, thump. No, Kieran breathed. The composure of the kingdom's greatest general shattered completely. He hit the courtyard like a devastating force of nature. The heavy iron gates ripped off their hinges as he smashed through them. The remaining guards turned, raising their weapons. Kieran didn't fight them. He erased them. The massive general moved with a blind, monstrous rage. Bodies hit the walls. Steel shattered. Within seconds, no one was left standing. Thorn had already fled the balcony, but Kieran didn't care about Thorn. He dropped to his knees on the hard stone. He pulled Zilia's limp body into his massive chest. Her skin was ice cold. The black veins had reached her neck. Thump. Kieran stopped breathing. He waited for the next beat. Silence. Total, absolute silence. The bond inside his chest went completely dark. The flat line echoed in his head, louder than a screaming crowd. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized his throat. The world distorted. No, 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 open your eyes. She didn't move. For a single, broken second, he believed he was too late. Then he moved. He drew his hunting dagger and slashed the blade deep across his own palm. The ancient supercharged blood of his lineage welled up instantly. He pressed his bleeding hand tightly against her lips. "Drink," he commanded, his voice cracking into a desperate plea. He forced the blood into her mouth. "Take it. Come back to me." Nothing happened. The cold-blooded executioner, the man who feared nothing, broke. He crushed her lifeless body against him. His massive frame shook violently. A raw, torn sound ripped from his chest, a jagged roar of pure, unadulterated agony. Then, a gasp. Xylia arched her back, coughing violently as the alpha blood fought the poison, burning the black veins away. Her chest heaved, pulling in jagged breaths of air. Before she could even open her eyes, Kieran locked his arms around her. He buried his face in her hair, holding her so tightly her ribs ached. He was trembling uncontrollably. "Never." His voice was a ragged, sobbing growl against her ear. "Don't you ever dare die on me again. I won't survive it." Chapter 4. The heavy oak doors of the great hall burst open. The loud bang echoed like a cannon shot, silencing the murmurs of the nobles. Xylia stood in the doorway. She was pale, her breathing shallow from the lingering poison, but she stood tall. Her eyes locked directly onto the throne. History was repeating itself. King Vorag sat above them all, wearing his stolen crown. Jack stood in the shadows, his eyes widening in pure shock. And Lord Thorn, smirking, arrogant Lord Thorn, stood on the stone steps. "You just don't know when to stay dead," Vorag sneered. Xylia walked slowly into the center of the hall. "I told you. I came to collect. How pathetic." Thorn chuckled, walking down the steps toward her. "The poison should have turned your heart to ash. It seems we need to do this the old-fashioned way." He lunged forward, his hand snapping out. He grabbed a brutal fistful of her hair, yanking her head back. Xylia gritted her teeth, refusing to make a sound. "On your knees, slave," Thorn hissed, trying to force her down, just like 10 years ago. Xylia didn't bend. She glared up at him with pure, venomous hatred. Vorag waved his hand lazily. "General Kieran, cut off her head. I am tired of looking at her." From the shadows behind the throne, the massive general stepped forward. The metallic shk of his black steel broadsword being drawn filled the dead silence of the room. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable stone. He walked down the steps. Thorn smiled. He pulled Xylia's hair tighter, exposing her pale neck for the executioner's blade. "Make it clean, General." Kieran didn't slow down. He raised the heavy black blade. For a fraction of a second, the blade hovered above her throat. Then he swung. A blinding flash of dark steel cut through the air. Thorn's smile vanished. The hand gripping Xylia's hair simply detached from his body. collective gasp ripped through the great hall. Thorn staggered backward, staring at his ruined arm in absolute disbelief. He opened his mouth, but before a single scream could leave his throat, the black blade blurred a second time. The brutal impact echoed through the hall. Thorn's lifeless body crashed down the stone steps and stopped at Zilia's feet. He died right where he once forced her to kneel. Dead silence, total paralyzing shock gripped the room. Jack stepped back, trembling. King Vorag shot up from his throne, his face turning purple with rage. Treason. Guards, kill him. Kill the traitor. None of the guards moved. They stared at the towering general in sheer terror. Kieran didn't even look at them. He stepped completely over Thorn's body. He turned his back to the king and stood directly in front of Zelia. He became an impenetrable, living shield between her and the rest of the world. "What is the meaning of this?" Vorag roared. "You swore an oath to the crown." "I swore an oath to the true crown," Kieran's voice rumbled, deep and terrifying. He slowly turned his head to look at Vorag. "My ancestors were the temple guards. We do not bow to false kings." Zelia's torn cloak slipped. The golden mark of the first alpha blazed against her scarred shoulder, illuminating the dark hall. The nobles began to back away, panic setting in as the ancient suffocating pressure of a true alpha filled the room. Kieran raised his black sword, pointing the blood-stained tip straight at King Vorag's chest. The general's eyes, normally pitch black, ignited with a furious, glowing blood red. The absolute limit of his self-control had been reached. "She is mine," Kieran roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the hall. "Touch her, and I will drown this kingdom in blood." No one breathed. Not a single blade dared to rise. Chapter 5. "Kill him," King Vorag screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Kieran. "Kill them both." 50 elite guards drew their weapons, but no one took a step forward. Kieran didn't even raise his blade. He simply drove his massive black broadsword straight down into the stone floor. The crack sounded like thunder. The marble shattered around the dark steel. He crossed his arms over his chest. "The doors stay closed," Kieran rumbled, his voice low and absolute. "Anyone who crosses this blade dies." He looked over his shoulder at Zelia. The blood-red glow in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. He nodded once. "Your turn." Zelia stepped out from behind his massive frame. She walked slowly toward the throne. Vorag's face twisted in panic, but he forced a cruel laugh. "You think you can challenge me? You are a branded slave. Your father cried like a pathetic pup when I broke his spine." Zelia stopped at the bottom of the steps. "My father died protecting his pack, and," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It echoed. It resonated with a strange, overlapping resonance, like 100 ancient voices speaking through her. "You will die protecting nothing." Jack, still cowering by the pillars, looked up. His eyes widened in absolute horror as the temperature in the great hall suddenly spiked. The golden mark on Zilia's shoulder flared to life. It didn't just glow, it burned. The golden light spiderwebbed across her neck, down her arms, illuminating her scars until she looked like a vessel holding a star. Vorag stumbled back, tripping over his own heavy robes. "What is that? What are you doing?" "Taking back my house." She didn't shift like a normal werewolf. There was no ugly sound of breaking bones or tearing flesh. There was only a blinding, explosive shockwave of golden fire and ash. The sheer force of her alpha aura hit the room like a physical hurricane. Every single noble in the great hall collapsed to their knees, gasping for air. The pressure was ancient, suffocating, and absolute. Jax was forced flat against the stones, sobbing as he realized exactly what and who he had rejected. When the golden light faded, Zelia was gone. In her place stood a massive, ethereal wolf. Her coat was pure, glowing silver, radiating a heat that singed the tapestries on the walls. Her eyes were twin suns of pure, untamed wrath. Vorag roared in terror. He shifted into his hulking brown wolf and lunged down the stairs. He never even touched her. The silver beast moved faster than light. She slammed into him with the force of a falling mountain. Vorag flew backward, crashing into his own throne. The heavy golden chair shattered into 100 pieces. Before he could get up, she was on him. She didn't kill him quickly. That wasn't the goal. She pinned him to the ruined floor by his throat, forcing the false king onto his belly in front of his entire court. Vorag whined, struggling wildly, but her grip was like a vice of pure iron. She clamped her jaws down over his muzzle. A sickening, heavy snap echoed through the dead silence of the hall. Vorag's alpha fangs hit the stone floor. He had been entirely, publicly broken, stripped of his weapons, his pride, and his power. The silver light flashed again, vanishing like smoke. Zelia stood in her human form, breathing heavily, the golden glow slowly fading from her veins. Vorag lay at her feet. He had shifted back to his human form, clutching his bleeding mouth, coughing and pathetic. He looked up at her. For the first time in his life, true, paralyzing terror filled his eyes. "Wait!" Vorag choked out, spitting blood onto the stones. He crawled backward, pressing his back against the rubble of his throne. "Wait, I surrender. I will give you everything back." Zelia didn't speak. She reached down and picked up a heavy iron spear dropped by one of the fleeing guards. "I'll give you your lands," Vorag begged, tears streaming down his face. "I'll restore your family name. You can be a lady again. Just let me live." Zelia stepped forward. She placed her heavy boot directly on his throat, pressing down just enough to cut off his frantic words. She looked down at the man who had ordered her death, ruined her body, and slaughtered her bloodline. "My family name is not yours to give." She raised the iron spear high into the air. No one moved. Not even Vorag dared to breathe. The spear came down, hard, final. The brutal impact echoed through the dead silence of the hall as the iron pierced straight through Vorag's chest, pinning him to the shattered stones. The false king's eyes went wide, then empty. For a long, agonizing moment, the hall was perfectly still. Then the wave began. No one cheered, no one spoke. They only bowed. Chapter 6. Zelia looked down at the bone crown resting by her blood-stained boots. The entire hall held its breath, waiting for her to place it on her head, waiting for her to claim the absolute power they were handing her. "Queen," an old lord whispered, his voice trembling. The word rippled through the massive room. "Queen, Queen." She reached down and picked it up. Instead of turning to the crowd, she walked toward the massive roaring fireplace at the end of the hall. Without a single second of hesitation, she threw the crown straight into the flames. The lords gasped in collective shock. "There are no more kings," Zelia declared. The fire reflected fiercely in her golden eyes as she watched the bone begin to blacken and crack. "And there are no more slaves. This cycle ends today." From across the room, Kieran watched her. His massive chest heaved. The blood-red fury in his eyes completely melted away, replaced by a blinding, unhinged worship. She had the entire world in the palm of her scarred hand, and she burned it for freedom. Zelia didn't look back. She turned her back on the throne, on the ashes, and on the kingdom that broke her. She walked out the heavy oak doors, stepping into the freezing wind of the wild. Kieran didn't wait. He unclasped his general's badge, the highest, most feared honor in the kingdom. He let it drop. The heavy silver slammed onto the blood-stained stones, instantly forgotten. He stepped right over it, his massive strides eating up the distance as he followed his new Huang into the storm. Chapter 7. The freezing wind of the wild bit into Xylia's skin, but she didn't slow down. The dark forest swallowed the light of the moon. She heard his heavy footsteps behind her. He didn't speak. He just followed. "Go back, Kieran," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the howling wind. "You have no king anymore. You are free. I am where I belong." Suddenly, his massive hand grabbed her wrist. He spun her around. The movement was so fast, so feral, she didn't have time to react before her back hit the rough bark of an ancient pine tree. Kieran crowded her. His massive frame blocked out the wind, the snow, the entire world. "General," she warned, her breath hitching as his blistering heat enveloped her. "Don't call me that," he growled. His voice was ragged, completely stripped of its usual cold control. "Not ever again." He dropped his forehead against hers. His heavy chest heaved. The terrifying, cold-blooded executioner was visibly trembling. "You threw away the crown," he breathed, his dark eyes searching hers with a desperate, unhinged obsession. "You threw away everything. I don't need a cage. Then let me be your cage." He didn't wait for an answer. He crashed his lips onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was 10 years of suppressed rage, paralyzing fear, and a terrifying, all-consuming need. Xylia gasped, her hands instinctively grabbing the thick fabric of his tunic. He tasted like blood, rain, and absolute devotion. Kieran's rough hands slid down her arms, pushing her torn cloak off her shoulders. The freezing air hit her bare skin, but he instantly replaced it with his burning heat. He pulled back, his breathing ragged. His eyes dropped to her left shoulder, to the jagged, ugly slave brand. Xylia tensed. She tried to turn away, but he held her firmly in place. "Look at me," he commanded softly. When she met his burning gaze, he lowered his head. He didn't kiss her lips. He pressed his mouth directly against the scarred, ruined flesh of the brand. Xylia stopped breathing. A violent shiver ripped down her spine. He kissed the first letter, then the next. He kissed the scar with a slow, agonizing reverence, treating the mark of her ultimate humiliation like the most sacred thing in the world. "Mine," he murmured against her skin. "My queen, my mate." The last walls around Xylia's heart shattered. The feral, untouchable first alpha finally let out a broken, breathless sound. She tangled her fingers into his dark hair, pulling him closer. "Claim me," she whispered fiercely. "Do it." Kieran's eyes flashed with a blinding, blood-red light. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the intoxicating scent of ancient ash. His fangs elongated, scraping dangerously against her pulse point. He bit down. The pain was a sharp, brilliant flash, but the rush of power that followed was absolute. Their souls slammed together, fusing in a blinding explosion of gold and red. The mate bond didn't just snap into place. It roared to life, unbreakable and eternal. When he finally pulled back, he gently licked the drop of blood from her neck. The storm around them seemed to quiet down. The first golden light of dawn began to break through the dark canopy of the trees. Kieran rested his hands on either side of her face. He looked deep into her glowing golden eyes. His voice was thick, entirely raw. "You were never broken, my queen," he whispered, tracing her jawline with a trembling thumb. "They were just too weak to survive your fire." Xylia smiled. and for the first time in 10 years, the smile reached her eyes. Together, the two most dangerous creatures in the realm walked into the sunrise, leaving the ashes of the old world far behind. Epilogue. Vex wiped down the sticky wooden counter. She didn't look up when the tavern door swung open, letting in a blast of freezing wind. "We're closed," the old information broker rasped, not missing a beat with her rag. "I just need a drink, Vex." Vex froze. She slowly raised her eyes. Zelia stood in the doorway. No heavy cloak, no hidden weapons, just the golden mark of the first alpha glowing faintly on her scarred shoulder, proud and exposed. And right behind her, the shadow. General Kieran, the man who had slaughtered the royal court and walked away without a scratch. He stood so close to Zelia that his massive chest brushed her back. His dark eyes scanned the empty tavern, cold and lethal, silently daring the shadows to move. Vex snorted. She tossed her rag aside and grabbed a dusty bottle of her most expensive whiskey. "Word on the street is you killed a king." "He tripped on an iron spear," Zelia said smoothly. She walked over and sat at the bar. Vex barked a laugh, pouring the dark liquid into a glass. "And the crown? The lords are crying that you threw 1,000 years of history into a fireplace." "It was ugly." Zelia took the glass. "And it didn't fit." Vex shook her head, smirking. Then she looked at the towering mountain of muscle, standing rigidly behind the new alpha. Kieran hadn't taken his eyes off Zelia. He wasn't watching the room. He was watching her, like she was the only breathing thing left in the world. "And the king's hound," Vex raised an eyebrow, her sharp tongue showing no fear. "I thought the great general only took orders from the throne." Kieran's jaw tightened. He stepped closer. His massive hands came down, resting heavily on Zelia's bare shoulders. The possessive weight of his touch was absolute. His thick thumbs gently traced the jagged edges of her old slave brand, not with pity, but with pure, unhinged reverence. "The throne is ash," Kieran rumbled. His deep voice vibrated through the quiet room, echoing with a lethal promise. "I guard the fire." Zelia smiled softly. She leaned back against his solid chest. Instantly, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The terrifying, cold-blooded executioner completely melted, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled her scent deeply, and a low, feral growl of pure satisfaction vibrated from his chest. "He's a good hound," Zelia murmured, resting her hand over his massive arm. Vex poured herself a drink, leaning against the wooden bar. "You two are going to give the neighboring kingdoms a heart attack. When they hear what happened today, they will come for you." Zelia picked up her glass. The golden fire of the first alpha flared in her eyes, bright and untamed. "Good. Let them come." She took a slow sip of the whiskey. "Tell the world the queen has returned, and this time she bites."